Ryu was a good character in Smash 4. He was essentially a heavy hitter with surprisingly fast attacks, which meant that he had a strong combo game and he had a whole slew of powerful KO options which could lead into KOs at low percents. Especially since Ryu had a handful of extremely fast KO confirms which were not particularly simple to punish. He did suffer from being on the slower side, lacking any great approach options, having an unspectacular grab game, and his recovery was quite exploitable, but these things were not too detrimental for Ryu overall. Also, don't even get me started on Ryu with Rage. By the end of Smash 4, Ryu was typically seen as a high tier or even a top tier, being around top 15 or even top 10 depending on who you asked. But what I am interested in today is that Smash 4 received numerous patches and Ryu was one of the game's DLC characters. He was released in patch 1.0.8 along with Roy. That's the wrong Roy, there we go. Lucas, and Diddy Kong's Up Air's funeral. These other characters received numerous changes throughout the game's life, but what about Ryu? What changes did he receive? Well, Ryu was basically exactly the same character at launch as he was in the final version of Smash 4.
Thanks for watching.
Wait, I'm not finished. Let me continue, Mega Speed.
No! Supershank.
Well, I'm continuing anyways. They did change, a few things. And there is one pretty significant difference which affected Ryu, so let's get into it. Also, Blue Headband Ryu is representing the final game while normal Ryu is representing launch Ryu. Whenever the topic of pre-patch Smash 4 Ryu comes up, which I know is almost never, but please bear with me here, there is only one change I've ever heard anyone mention, and that change is that they made Ryu's turnaround 3 frames slower, which made it easier to perform directional inputs. This definitely sounds like a change, but here's the thing. This is what Ryu's turnaround looks like in the current version of Smash 4. A thing to note is that Ryu did not have an auto turnaround in Smash 4, so you had to manually turn around like any other character. Now let's go to 1.0.8. You can tell it's 1.0.8 because Zelda's jab dealt way less damage and Ryu is actually here. Now let's turn around a bunch with Ryu. I don't see a difference. This is the only Ryu change I have heard of, and as far as I can tell, it doesn't exist. I can't find any game data which disproves it, and I can't tell any difference from actually playing as Ryu, so I don't think this change is even real. I have no idea where the turnaround change even came from, or the very specific 3 frames faster point. I can only assume that someone dreamt it up and then put it on the internet and it was just accepted as a fact. So it turns out that the only confirmed Ryu change on the internet is probably not even real. I'm not sure what else to say about this, but this does bring up another question. Did Ryu have any direct changes that aren't widespread on the internet? The answer is technically
yes,
but they aren't impactful things to say the least. Ryu turns around earlier when performing a forward roll compared to earlier versions, which is purely aesthetic. And this one flag during focus attack activates 1 frame later than it did originally. Now, what exactly does this flag do?
I don't know.
Your guess is as good as mine because I have no idea. The move is still functionally the exact same though, so yeah. Those were all the changes Ryu got outside of universal changes and they literally didn't do anything. For all intents and purposes, Ryu is 100%
absolutely, positively, most assuredly
exactly the same character now as he was at launch. Well, that was 3.5 minutes of my life wasted. I'm going home. Wait! It is not over yet. While Ryu himself was not changed throughout Smash 4's life, Smash 4 itself did change, and there was one universal change in particular which significantly affected Ryu. One of Ryu's strengths in Smash 4 is that he had very strong shield pressure. Ryu had multiple completely safe on shield aerials, he had a few tools which would melt your shield, and Ryu's up tilt and down tilt were both very potent shield pressuring tools. But more on them later. Ryu overall has very potent shield pressuring potential in the final game, and it is one of the things which makes him so terrifying at close range. Because not only is he going to completely destroy you if he gets the hit, but even if you shield, you are still not safe from his pressure. But while Ryu's shield pressure is quite potent in the final game, it was not like that at launch. When Ryu was introduced in Smash 4, shields were very different. Shields originally had less shield stun and they had more shield pushback. Mario's up smash, for example, is minus 20 on shield in the final version of Smash 4, but in earlier versions, it had 5 frames less shield stun, so it was only minus 25, despite being the exact same move. Power shielding also reduced shield stun in the final game, but it did not in earlier versions. Although power shields were still more more potent than early Smash 4 due to the overall lower shield stun. This on its own doesn't sound too great for Ryu. His attacks are less safe on shield, which is not ideal for him, but this is fairly standard and it applied to pretty much every other character in the game. However, there was an extra factor which made shields extra bad for Ryu in particular at launch. In early versions of Smash 4, hit lag multipliers affected the safety of attacks on shield. In later versions of Smash 4, it does not matter what the hit lag multiplier an attack has. The safety of an attack purely comes down to the amount of shield stun it has, which depends on the amount of damage an attack deals. In earlier versions, however, irregular hit lag multipliers did affect shield safety. This is extremely important because Ryu's entire moveset has way above average hit lag. This, I imagine, is mainly a homage to Street Fighter where hit lag is higher than in Smash. In the final game, this mainly means that Ryu's attacks are easier to DI and SDI compared to other characters, which is not a good thing, but it isn't a game breaker by any means. It also makes his special cancel moves easier to, well, special cancel, which is nice. At launch, however, this higher hit lag made Ryu's moveset much worse on shield. How exactly did this work? Let's look at one of Ryu's attacks to explain how this worked. Ryu's Nair is a really fast move of excellent combo potential. The move only has 6 frames of landing lag, which is abnormally low in Smash 4. In the final game, the move has 6 frames of shield stun, which combined with its 6 frames of landing lag makes the move 0 on shield, which is extremely good. Ryu could very easily pressure shielding opponents after a Nair with his extremely fast and deadly tilts, his shield breaking strong F tilt, his grabs, or his fully intangible devastating DP. They couldn't punish him and most characters couldn't escape Ryu's faster options either. The opponent just has to take a guess, and if they guessed wrong, it could basically be over for them. The move is even safe on power shield at -1, which is absolutely wild. Some characters still get put into the blender when they power shield Nair. At launch, however, the shield differences meant that the move was not 0 on shield. The move only had 3 frames of shield stun. Logically, you would think that this move would be -3 on shield combined with its 6 frames of landing lag, which would still be really good. It wouldn't give Ryu a guaranteed turn, but he would at least still be safe against almost the entire cast. But here's the thing, it wasn't -3 in earlier versions. It was -9. Instead of the move giving Ryu a free mix-up or at least keeping him safe, it instead left Ryu fairly punishable against most of the cast. A move with 6 frames of landing lag and 3 frames of shield stun was -9 on shield at best. So what gives? How does the opponent have more time to punish Ryu than the amount of ending lag he has? The answer is hit lag. Ryu's sweet spot Nair deals 8% damage. Attacks which deal 8% have 7 frames of hit lag, but remember, Ryu's Nair has a 1.8 hit lag multiplier which gives it 13 frames of hit lag. 6 more frames than an 8% attack with no extra hit lag. When you hit an opponent with Nair, both Ryu and his opponent will freeze for 13 frames. Pretty standard stuff. When the opponent shields Nair in the final game, Ryu and his opponent once again go through the same amount of hit lag before they start moving again. Pretty simple. Remember that this move is 0 on shield in the final game. But when Ryu was first added to Smash 4, that is not what happened. When launch Ryu hit an opponent's shield with Nair, Ryu would once again go through the 13 frames of hit lag his Nair causes as you'd expect. The opponent, on the other hand, would only go through the 7 frames of hit lag caused by a normal 8% attack, giving them 6 less frames of hit lag than Ryu. Once the opponent's hit lag ends, they will go into shield stun, and once shield stun ends, the opponent can do whatever out of shield option they want, and for a 3 frame period of time, the opponent can do whatever they want while Ryu is completely frozen. Unable to move or do anything, Ryu is just stuck in the air, watching his opponent start their out of shield punish and knowing his ultimate fate. Eventually, he can move, but it is too late by then. Before he can do anything... Die! Meanwhile, in the final game, the opponent grabs and... So this is what happened with almost the entirety of launch Ryu's moveset due to the extra hit lag on his attacks. The opponent would quite literally recover from shield stun while Ryu was still frozen from hit lag, which essentially gave more or less his entire moveset a negative amount of shield stun. Ryu's Nair is just a single example I wanted to use, but I want to discuss how this affected a few more of his moves. Ryu's light up tilt and down tilt are pretty strong on shield in the final version. If you loop them, the opponent only has 3 frames to punish, which is not enough for almost the entire cast. You can't even roll away from these looped moves at close range, which is wild. If the opponent even tries to punish or escape and they fail, All of this also means that Ryu can easily get away with throwing out one up tilt or down tilt on shield into further mix-ups, because while they are technically punishable on their own, why would you even want to try and punish them when this can happen to you? At launch, however, the opponent had 11 or 12 frames respectively to interrupt the loops, which is more than enough for pretty much everyone. You can shield up tilt or down tilt and then do a punish which will beat the loop, as well as not doing the loop, which was way more unsafe in vanilla. In all fairness, Ryu could do a true DP to beat a looped up tilt punish on shield, but this was naturally very risky. And there were a handful of characters who could punish Ryu before he even had the opportunity to do a DP. Because for the first 5 frames where the opponent can punish the up tilt, Ryu is frozen. And in down tilt's case, Ryu was frozen for 7 extra frames. So frame 6 and 7 punishes, including grabs, were fast enough to prevent Ryu from going for a true DP punish after down tilt, so yeah. This also means that the entire cast has enough time to prevent Ryu from going for this DP on Power Shield. The entire cast on Power Shield. And Ryu can still do this DP mix-up in the final game, but it is better, as it is completely uninterrupted on startup, including on Power Shield. And it cleanly beats the opponent dropping their shield, which it did not do in earlier versions. One last move on shield I want to talk about is Ryu's strong F-tilt. The move deals a big chunk of shield damage, and it could easily lead into a shield break if your shield wasn't full. Ryu even has setups into an F-tilt for a shield break, and while these are a bit gimmicky, they aren't entirely unreasonable to get either due to Ryu's wild shield pressure, making you scared to do anything out of shield. So if that's how it is in the final game, what was the problem originally? Well, F-tilt has 2 hits with only a 2-frame gap in between the hits. In the final game, both hits are a true block string, so if you block the first hit, you are forced to block the second hit. The move is punishable on shield at -14 if your shield doesn't break, but if it does break,
that will die.
At launch, however, F-tilt was not a true block string. If you shielded the first hit in vanilla, you had 6 frames to avoid the second hit. This is because, once again, Ryu is frozen for 4 frames while the opponent can act. This means that if the opponent shields the first hit of strong F-tilt, they can just roll to avoid the second hit and safely get away from Ryu. Most of the shield damage comes from the second hit, so your shield won't even take that much damage. And you will be at a safe distance away from Ryu, and Ryu really doesn't want you to be far away from him. A handful of characters can even flat out interrupt the second hit if they shield the first hit, so that wasn't ideal for Ryu either. The one somewhat good thing for Ryu about this, which is no longer the case, is that if you drop your shield or attempt a bad punish, the second hit of F-tilt will hit you, but that isn't the end of the world if that happens, and it can be avoided with matchup familiarity. And getting hit by the second hit is still preferable to getting your shield broken and dying. Shielding the second hit was potentially ideal at launch because it was -24 in shield, which could lead into some big punishes. Considerably more so than in the final game, as you have 10 more frames to punish Ryu. But if your shield wasn't full, it was a very good thing that you had the option to just escape. In the current version, if the move can break your shield, it will break your shield and there is nothing you can do about it, but originally, you could avoid that shield break and that made strong F-tilt far more gimmicky. Also, most of the cast could interrupt the move on Power Shield while taking no shield damage. While in the final game, you're still forced to shield the whole thing, although you will take less shield damage. And those are the main shield related things I wanted to talk about. You can of course go through Ryu's entire move list and find even more examples of moves being safe now but unsafe at launch, or special cancels which were way more gimmicky at launch, but I've gone on long enough about this. We would be here all day if I went through every single one of Ryu's moves. The TLDR is that almost every single move Ryu has was around 10 frames worse on shield at launch than they are now, which is absolutely huge. This is a much bigger difference across an entire moveset than pretty much every other character in the game. Overall, Ryu is the exact same character on paper. There's no more I can say on that front. But while Ryu's attributes and moveset are exactly the same as they were at launch, Ryu heavily benefited from the changes made to shields which came about in 1.1.1. Ryu all of a sudden went from a stupidly unsafe character with an abnormally unsafe moveset for the frame data he had, to a stupidly safe character with some of the best shield pressure in the entire game. The shield changes quite literally turned one of Ryu's weaknesses into a strength, and that is kind of crazy. Ryu might possibly have been the character who benefited the most from the shield changes, as it made his moveset so much safer on shield and it gave him so much additional shield pressure that was previously completely avoidable, and his out of shield punish game really wasn't hurt that much by these changes, so it was a big benefit to Ryu overall. The shield changes were honestly a bit of a game changer for Ryu, and that is wild. In terms of where Ryu would have been ranked at launch, it is hard to say, but I imagine he may have been mid tier rather than high tier. He still had the crazy punish game, but he had to take much bigger risks as everything he did was much more punishable on shield. Ryu took a risk with everything he threw out. Almost all of the tricks he had could be consistently beaten on shield by a good chunk of the cast, and even if they couldn't, the opponent could still easily escape and get away from Ryu. This simply isn't the case in current Smash, or as the opponent has to rely far more on whiff punishing Ryu and forcing him to make mistakes, which isn't as effective as just shielding and ruining his day. The top tiers back then were later nerfed and new top tiers would emerge through DLC and or buffs, but I don't think that was much of a factor in this case. Ryu did end up struggling more as Smash 4's meta progressed, and if shields were never changed, he would have fallen off a lot faster and harder. With all that being said though, Ryu was still easily the best DLC character at the time. Mewtwo was still a lacking character at the time, and the other dumb DLC characters were still not quite ready to terrorize the world. But Ryu definitely would have had a harder time if the game was never updated further.
Thanks for watching.
Guys,
Just smash the like button, comment and subscribe.